Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer. Buddha at the Gas Pump is an ongoing series of interviews with spiritually awakening people. I've done about 580 of them now. If this is new to you and you'd like to check out some of the previous ones, please go to batgap.com, B-A-T-G-A-P, and look under the past interviews menu. This program is made possible through the support of appreciative listeners and viewers. So if you appreciate it and would like to help support it, there's a PayPal button on every page of the website. And there's also a page with our address and stuff about, if you don't want to use PayPal, you can support it in other ways. My guest today is Sebene Selassie. Sebene is a teacher, author, and speaker who explores the themes of belonging and identity through meditation, creativity, and spirituality. Born in Ethiopia and raised in Washington, D.C., she began studying Buddhism 30 years ago as an undergraduate at McGill University, where she majored in comparative religious studies. She has an M.A. from the New School, where she focused on race and cultural studies. For over 20 years, she worked with children, youth, and families nationally and internationally for small and large not-for-profits. She mentioned to me that she spent a year in Africa working in a refugee camp. Now she teaches classes, workshops, and retreats regularly and is one of the most popular teachers on the 10% Happier app. That's Dan Harris's app. And Dan has been on Batgap. Sebene is a 3-time cancer survivor of stage 3 and 4 breast cancer. Her first book, You Belong, A Call for Connection, is published by Harper One. And I should mention that Sebene's, some of her primary teachers were Thanissaro and Kittisaro, a couple who teach together, and they were on Batgap also some years ago. So welcome, Sebene. It's good to be doing this finally.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I think I might have first discovered you on Dan's podcast or something, or I forget, but I don't listen to it regularly, but you kind of popped up, and I thought, wow, she looks interesting. Let's check her out.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's start with a little bit of the biographical history, which I just sketched out, but there's some interesting details to it. Your book is very honest and vulnerable. You bravely discuss things that some people might feel a little shy about discussing, but you just go into it. And I think that's good because everybody goes through things. We all do, we all have. And I think it helps people gain greater confidence in their own possibilities if they realize that, well, he or she went through this, that, and the other thing, and, really screwed up here and there or whatever. And yet, look at them now. They're doing pretty well. And, maybe that's a possibility for me, too.
Yeah, I use belonging in the book and generally as a metaphor for ways that we feel at home, connected, the ways that we're awakening, feel joy, freedom. And so not belonging are all the ways that we feel like we are not enough, that we're screwing up, that we're not measuring up, whether that's from our own personal experience or from what society might be telling us about us, depending on our identities, our past, our culture or history. And I also look a lot and work a lot with our ancestral or cultural conditioning. So the things that, we come into this life with epigenetically or genetically.
Yeah. I remember hearing you say in some interview that you briefly considered writing a book about your cancer experience, but you really didn't feel like focusing a whole book on that. And so you discuss it some in the book, but you chose to write about belonging. Why was that your choice?
One, I really wanted to choose a theme that was positive and encouraging, as you were describing, something that many people could relate to. And cancer was not a pleasant experience, let's say that. I learned a lot from it. I wouldn't change my experience, but I kind of didn't want to focus on something that was particularly unique, even though there are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people who could relate. But I also didn't want to focus on something that was about difficulty only.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of people say that, and I've said it myself, that I wouldn't change my experience. I mean, obviously it's kind of a moot point because we can't change our past experience. But I guess it implies that, as difficult as it was, I learned something from it. And it also kind of implies, to my mind, that there's a kind of divine orchestration of the universe, and things just don't happen arbitrarily. They happen for a reason, not necessarily a reason that our intellects can grasp, but somehow or other, there's life is for learning, as Joni Mitchell sang, and we're, how to put this, like, the universe isn't just sort of cruel, or it has an evolutionary I can't never say that word, trajectory. And anything that happens in the big picture, if you can zoom out far enough, is conducive to our spiritual evolution. Do you agree with that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I've been writing recently in my newsletter and blog about cultivating sacred trust, which is the way that I've been kind of approaching it. And so it's trusting things that we can't understand, all the myriad causes and conditions that led to this moment that are unchangeable. And so there's a way that when we don't trust that, we're being in contention with reality in some way, that we're wishing for a better past, as some people sometimes say. And the sacred part of it is the mystery that you're describing, that there's some kind of evolutionary, mysterious quality to why we're in this moment that we're in right now, and really trusting that. And then the response that can come from that can, of course, invite change or progress or even challenge,
Yeah, Irene was just writing an email to somebody who had written in to say that he was just very disturbed by everything that's going on in Washington, D.C., and what, it was really bringing him down. And she was saying some things to try to encourage him. And somehow I remembered a song that I'd heard decades ago called, I think it was a jazz song called The Creator Has a Master Plan. I looked it up. It was by Pharoah Sanders.
Oh, yeah, I love that song.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're talking about. As a Buddhist, I don't know if you dwell too much on there being a creator, because Buddhists tend not to, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I although that author byline or subtitle lists me as a Buddhist, I don't really. That's kind of tongue in cheek in some ways, and honoring in others, just honoring how much I've learned from that lineage, but I don't necessarily identify as a Buddhist in the sense that, the Buddha wasn't a Buddhist, but gained a lot from those teachings. And I wholly kind of surrender to the mystery of it all, that I can't say what exists or how it exists in terms of how this all began. But there's definitely, an order, or at least an unfolding to this that is beyond our logical comprehension.
Yeah. I always say it's like God is hiding in plain sight. If you look at anything closely enough, you see this marvelous orderliness and creativity at play.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we'll play around with the notion of belonging, since that was what your book was about. But let's start by, what is the deepest way that you could define the word belonging and the concept it represents?
I use these two sentences throughout the book, and they, to me, really speak to the paradox of belonging. To me, that is the deepest sense of belonging that I've come to, is accepting that paradox. And so in the book, I say that we are not separate and we are not the same. Mm. And to me, that balancing of what seemingly is contradictory has been where I've found belonging. And that means both fully embracing that interconnectedness, which is undeniable, whether we look at it scientifically or whether we look at it spiritually, our own experience in nature, or, as you said, looking closely at kind of the wonders or marvels of the world around us, to fully understand and embrace that interconnection, that non-separation, and it's not a but, it is an and, to acknowledge that we incarnate or we come into this world differentiated, and that there is experiences and realities and histories and trajectories related to that difference. And that's not something to be ignored or bypassed, but actually when we can reckon with these two truths, and in the Mahayana especially, Buddhist tradition, they're called the two truths of the paradox of the two truths, because they do seem paradoxical, that, for me, that's been kind of the richest exploration of belonging.
Yeah, I've used the word paradox so many times in these interviews that somebody once sent me a T-shirt with that word on it.
That's great.
And yeah, Hinduism has a similar idea that they have a term called Vyavaharika Satyam, which means transactional reality, which means, and they use examples like clay pots, which are nothing but clay, so there really is only clay, but yet there are pots, and you can't deny the pots. It would be absurd to do so.
Yeah, and when we get to the complexity of our lives today with extreme polarization, the multitude of identities, the fact that we are aware of so much more in terms of not just within our own communities, but throughout the world, that complexity becomes even more important to navigate for all of our well-being.
One thing that comes to mind with your paradox point is that there's no conflict between the sort of two levels of reality we're talking about, absolute and relative, if you want to call it that. And in fact, there can be a very complementary or mutually enriching relationship between them. I don't know if the absolute can be enriched, but the relative or the diversity of creation can certainly be enriched by taking recourse or anchoring ourselves or having access to the absolute level.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think of it in terms of kind of the actual people that I encounter in my work and in my life. And yes, I think that people who kind of immerse themselves in the relative reality, I see this true with a lot of activists and spiritual activists and people who are, really trying to address the injustices and the harms and the inequities of our world, that there can be a deep refuge and rest and solace in the absolute. And not just as a means to an end, not to rest, to go do more, but as a real deep understanding. And I think that, conversely, there can be a real refuge in, let's say, the relative for folks who tend to kind of shoot off to the absolute, bypass into oneness and kind of not want to reckon with the realities. And we see that in the US anyways today. People who've not wanted to kind of reckon with the realities of history and the chickens coming home to roost, as it's said.
Yeah. Who was it? Stephen Wright had a joke. He said, I broke up with my girlfriend because I wasn't really into meditation and she really wasn't into being alive.
Yeah, and that living is, it's glorious and it's wonderful, and it also has its challenges, and it has its realities and heartbreaks, and being willing to open to those and actually work with them together in community, I think is one of the riches of the relative.
Yeah. So maybe a main point we're making here is that, you can't take refuge in the absolute to the exclusion of the relative. If you do, that's called spiritual bypassing, and we can talk more about that. And if if your life is all about the relative without access or recourse to the absolute, then it doesn't have a foundation and all kinds of problems result, which is the experience of most people.
Yes, and both of them will be in contention with the reality of the two truths being true.
Yeah. I have some notes here, and as we go along, if any thought pops into your head and I'm not asking a question about it, just go ahead and start talking about it, and we'll get into it. So I'm going to kind of sketch through some notes I took while reading your book. And the first chapter is entitled The Delusion of Separation. We were never separate. And then I have some subpoints, but you can riff on just that chapter head, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, I think we've been talking about it a bit already, that there's a delusion of separation kind of in either pole of these two truths. And, it's really at the heart of why we don't feel we belong. It's at the heart of all the divisions we see politically and socially. And it's a hard truth to contend with, that truth of non-separation, when we're kind of mired in our own gunk. I think we're feeling that sense of separation, again, because of things from our past, things from our ancestry, things in our world around us. So I use a lot my own example of immigrating, growing up in DC in the early 70s, so long before the kind of wave of Ethiopians turned it into little Addis Ababa. And so being very different, growing up in white neighborhoods and not being as wealthy as the folks around us, and eating different foods and speaking a different language, and just generally encountering some really nasty racism in the neighborhood and in the larger community. And so, that sense of feeling separate, feeling like you don't belong, can come through so many channels kind of in our lives. So unlearning that delusion is, I think, where the path starts, and why I started with that. And I use both scientific examples, just the truth of our deep interconnection that modern and science is continuing to uncover the truths of that more and more, and the mystery of that and the paradox of it. But I also point to ancient ways of knowing, which for many, many years were dismissed by kind of modernist thinking or dualistic thinking.
Sometimes I think, I fantasize. I think, wow, I wish I could have had my current state of consciousness or whatever when I was in high school. It would have been such a better experience, back then. And if I have it to do over again, I hope I don't have to go through all that confusion. But
Can I say something about
please.
that? So, I think, and this is kind of the not being in contention with reality and seeing the perfection of things as they are. I often point to this when I talk about the word mindfulness, and how it's a misnomer, and how it's really an embodied awareness. And I did not have that. I was really, really in my head and a lot in my heart, like very emotional as a young person, but I really wasn't connected to my body. And as I've gotten reconnected to my body, it's actually, I feel like I'm a better teacher of how to have embodied presence, because I had to map my way back to that. And so I can kind of lead people. Whereas some people I know who are just like naturally embodied, have that innate sense, it's kind of hard for them to explain to other people how to do it, because it comes so innately for them. And I think the same is true with belonging. Like, this is why my author title also includes Weirdo. So there's like a great power in kind of being a weirdo, like that if we've experienced that alienation, if we've experienced that sense of lostness, we can actually help lead others in a much more authentic way. So,
yeah. Let your freak flag fly, as Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young sang.
Exactly. People will find your flag.
Yeah. When I think about how confused I was as a kid, and I see how kind of so much craziness in society and everything. It's like, what was that Kurt Vonnegut story, Welcome to the Monkey House or something? Or maybe I'm thinking of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Like the whole world is sort of a cuckoo's nest. It's like we're all crazy to one degree or another. And the truly sane ones are few and far between. And even them, they are kind of crazy.
Yeah, let's see who's using those words for whom, and who gets labeled with those. But there's definitely some truth in kind of who's outside. I use this metaphor of margin and center in the book to describe, we often talk about marginalized people as if everyone wants to be in the center. And my argument is that actually from the margins, you have much greater perspective, that you have a bigger understanding. If the center is everyone kind of looking in at fool's gold, they don't really know what's going on in the rest of society and culture. And so marginalized people, like people of color, or poorer people, LGBTQI people, those who find themselves on the margins for whatever reasons often have to travel into the center because that's where the resources are, that's where power is, that's where we get educated. But those of us who kind of go in and out, we have this perspective on the world that is much wider, is much more holistic. And so, yeah, again, like who decides the labels of what's in, what's out, what's sane, what's crazy, what's margin, what's center.
Yeah. In the world, but not of it. Wise as serpents, gentle as doves. Yeah, but actually, in a way, I mean it literally. Obviously, it's a relative term, craziness or sanity or whatever. But, here we are, we come into this life without a clue of what's going on, and usually born into a dysfunctional family. And, we grow up and it's kind of scary, and, we just kind of bumble along, and some people go their whole lives without any sort of serious introspection or deep exploration or anything like that. Most people do, as a matter of fact. And if that's the way one is functioning, then inevitably the society, if the vast majority of people are functioning that way, the society is just going to be, full of problems and difficulties and, mistreatment of people and, all kinds of cruelties and horrors.
Yeah, and most people aren't conditioned or cultured to take time to look at that, and if we do take contemplative time, that starts to reveal itself because we're not caught up in our busyness or in our habituated activities. And I would say that it's really exciting for that reason, that so many more people are coming to meditation and to contemplative practices. And, I know since a little bit from our chat before we started that you've been in this world for a long time. And so it's not new to you, but the kind of mainstream acceptance of this is really revolutionary. And in fact, I think is pointing to a reckoning with that, at least with the fatigue of that way of living.
Yeah. And that point really excites me because I've always felt that, based upon what I just said, that, the forest is a collection of trees, the society is a collection of individuals. And, if the forest is gray and withering, it's because the trees are unhealthy. And if the society is crazy and full of problems, it's because most of the individuals making it up are not really accessing their full potential. And so I've always been excited about the kind of sociological implications of spiritual development and how, if it became profound and widespread enough, it could really transform the world. And in fact, unless that does happen, the world will, keep stumbling along with more and more severe problems. So the fact that we face sort of potentially humanity-ending problems now in the world, I think is exciting that crisis seems to be getting met by an upsurge or an epidemic of interest in spirituality, and many people just really taking it to heart.
Yeah, and I'm really excited, especially by the younger generation that is, really so much more comfortable than, let's say, I was, kind of coding my language around it for many years, and not really sharing my practices very much. Not that I would ever kind of proselytize to people, but just not even really talking about it very much with even close friends, and this surge in these young people just being completely open and honest about their practice, their spiritual practice, but also their healing and their admission of trauma and of reckoning with both the internal and the relative, as well as the kind of larger spiritual or interconnected truths.
That's great. Are you seeing that firsthand? Do you work much with young people?
Yeah, and when I say young, I think younger than me, so that's a pretty wide range. I'm not necessarily talking about teenagers, although I worked with teens a lot in my life. But yeah, I do see a lot of people on retreats and in workshops and classes who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s. Yeah,
that's exciting. Yeah, so I mean, if the young people are taking to things en masse, then that's a harbinger of what's to come, because that what they're doing, if they're doing it in larger numbers, will become more mainstream in the coming decades.
Yes, definitely. There are a lot of witches on Instagram.
Witches?
Yes.
I'm too old to understand what that reference is.
There's a huge surge in magic and mysticism, astrology, and spiritual an embrace of kind of ancient wisdom traditions and mystical practices that is very different than kind of the surge in mindfulness meditation, which had to be delivered in sort of this very conservative, palatable to the mainstream way.
Oh, well, that's good to know. Yeah, as you know, I was a student of Maharishi's for many years, and one thing he said, he had this whole discussion about how what he called natural law kind of tapered off and diminished over long periods of time, just until it kind of hit a nadir. And then he felt that there would be a resurgence to its full expression in one generation, in a relatively short amount of time. And he spent a lot of time talking about ancient cultures and the importance of their revivification, their emergence again, and that they had so much to offer, and that we had totally destroyed them, and too much to our own detriment.
Yeah, that sounds very prophetic and powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of ancient cultures, one of the bullet points that we haven't discussed yet, moving along, is one of the points in your book is rocks are people, ancient and modern metaphors. What is that about?
Yeah, I bring that in. I was on a trip in South Africa, actually to go on retreat, a month-long retreat with Thanissaro and Kitisaro at their hermitage, Dharmagiri. And I was traveling with a group of friends from New York, and we were at Freedom Park, which is a kind of a living museum. And the guide was giving us kind of a quick kind of summary of South African history and spirituality, and he was talking about Ubuntu, which is a term from the Bantu language that is often translated as "I am because we are," "I am because you are," and it's often referred to just in terms of humanistic connection. It's a humanist philosophy. But when he was describing it, he mentioned that truth, and then he kind of paused. And maybe I think because he kind of could see that we probably wouldn't understand the depth of what that meant, he said, everything is people. Mountains are people, and sky is people, and rivers are people, and rocks are people. And so to me, that declaration points to the ancient understanding of that scientific truth, that there is kind of that fundamental non-separation, interconnection at the heart of being that the ancients understood. And a lot of our kind of scientific rediscovery of that is healing from the denial of that so much of early scientific materialism touted, this separation, this lack of connection with the truth. And I go on, or maybe before that, I talk about this word epistemicide.
Oh yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, which is a word that you can understand the root epistemology, epista from like epistemology, or side, like genocide, and it refers to the killing of ways of knowing. And it's often used in post-colonial theory to describe not just the kind of material or human harm that came from colonialism and the genocide that it wrought, as well as the Atlantic slave trade, but also the cultural and wisdom that was lost, the cultural knowledge that was killed off. And not just because peoples were killed, but because there was an active destruction of other ways of knowing. There was a dismissal. Indigenous peoples were not allowed to practice their spiritual practices or speak their languages in settler colonial states around the world. And so epistemocide kind of points to that historical legacy of damage that we're all reckoning with now, and how we come back from that in a way that's honoring that this truth that this scientific world is kind of rediscovering now is something that ancient wisdom has always known.
Yeah, it seems to me it was largely most of the colonizers were Christian, and very often fundamentally so. And I mean, if you read about the accounts of how indigenous people were treated, it's incredibly horrific. It kind of it's comparable with anything the Nazis did in Germany. But there was this conceit, this arrogance, like, we've got the truth and these people are just primitive morons, and aren't they silly, thinking that rocks are alive, or that trees have some kind of consciousness, or some such things. Whatever they pondered it, they just thought these people were all over the world, all the different cultures that were colonized, that were just primitive, backward, and given the evangelical sentiment that they needed saving or converting, to our wise way of thinking. And
yeah. And with this conversation, because I'm writing from a particular position and from particular communities, I'm also pointing to and challenging my own communities, including mindfulness communities that tend to kind of privilege scientific research about mindfulness and meditation, and provable, quote unquote, provable ways for us to kind of swallow these medicines, and dismissing a lot of the mystical aspects and a lot of the more mysterious elements of the practice and of the traditions that they come from, and the type of arrogance that is. It's a more subtle arrogance, because it doesn't carry kind of the violence, let's say, that you were describing just now, but there is still a conceit and an arrogance in it that really lacks, to me, curiosity about, what exactly were they speaking to, in these ancient texts or these practices.
Yeah, and getting back to our paradox point, there's no harm in hooking meditators up to EEGs and, doing all kinds of research. That does not in any way diminish the mystical dimensions that they may experience through their practice, or the reality of those dimensions. I mean, the Dalai Lama is a good example of somebody who appreciates both and encourages the scientists, but totally appreciates the mystics of his and other traditions.
Yep, exactly. I totally agree.
Yeah. And actually, I think it's important that both be appreciated, because it would definitely be a tragedy to dumb down spiritual traditions and say, oh, it's just some kind of changes in brain chemistry or something. And yet, on the other hand, we live in a scientific age, and science is the predominant paradigm. And so if spiritual practices can be verified and understood more scientifically and neurophysiologically and all, it'll help to introduce spirituality more widely into our world.
Yes, and for me, coming back to the start of the conversation and cultivating sacred trust, it's really understanding that everything is sacred. That it's that trust in this present moment to understand that our scientific evolution or technology is not the enemy in some way, and that we have to return to some pristine past. I went through, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, a period where I was only doing natural therapies when I was first diagnosed with breast cancer. And my kind of radical or revolutionary take was not to turn to alternative medicine, it was to turn to allopathic medicine and sort of accept the chemo and the radiation, which I did massive amounts of, and to do that wisely, and working with doctors that I really trusted, who would also help me with complementary care. And it was really recognizing kind of the sacrament of a pill or of an infusion, and so there we can kind of again lean to one side or another in our choosing of something, and in that rejection, not recognize that we're just in kind of the same kind of battle or struggle with life.
Yeah, and the last couple of points we've discussed can be glommed together and made really relevant to what's going on right now, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and there is a very good chance the pandemic will be worsened and prolonged by people who, in my opinion, have an unscientific attitude toward what's actually going on. And it's nuanced because obviously, modern medicine has done harm in various ways, but it's also done so much good. I mean, so many, huge epidemics like smallpox and polio have been wiped out through vaccines. So I'm kind of tuned into this issue and think about it a lot. And maybe you could comment on what I just said.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not a medical professional at all, so I can't sort of advise others on what's right for them. And really, it is about your own choices in terms of what you feel is logical, right, healthy for you. And for me, just someone who practices watching my mind and kind of really understanding where my thoughts, my opinions, my views come from, just noticing our tendency to kind of outright reject things because we have a kind of a solidified opinion about something. And, I actually haven't done that much research or understanding or made decisions not from fear or from upset or from kind of habituated ideas about whatever it is, doctors or medicine or technology. And so, it's interesting to see people kind of take sides as if there's a side in this situation. This is maybe the first time in history where we are all experiencing the same situation at once globally. Whether I talk to my cousins in Ethiopia or, we witness kind of the reality across Europe and Asia. We're all in this, and so there's no side to take. There's really exploration, conversation, understanding, and choices that are good for all of us.
Yeah, and I think there's something which everyone could use more of, but which is critical on the spiritual path, which is discernment or discrimination. People are susceptible to being convinced by information they take in. And, these days people are very polarized in this country and perhaps around the world. And it's actually very characteristic of the spiritual community too. There's this term conspirituality, which is popular these days, where the spiritual community has been so infiltrated by a lot of conspiracy theory thinking, and people have undergone really strange shifts in their orientation, politically and with regard to the pandemic and everything else, which is kind of tearing the spiritual community apart, as well as it tears families apart outside this community.
Yeah, I've been kind of witnessing that from afar. I'm I don't know, maybe fortunate, maybe I would understand more that I don't have kind of that in my circles. so much, but I know that it's been really challenging for folks who have to deal with parents who are, COVID deniers or refuse to wear a mask, and there's a lot of fear for ourselves and for others connected to that.
Yeah. So anyway, the point to end this little bit on is just that there are books and talks and all kinds of emphasis in various spiritual traditions about the importance of developing discernment or discrimination as we go along. And we don't get off the hook at any point, really. I think it's something that will be with us as long as we're alive. It's easy to get sidetracked. It's easy to get confused. It's easy to go off into, little cul-de-sacs and get stuck. So go ahead. You were going to say.
Yeah, as you say that, it just points to me, and this is true, and excuse me, in all spiritual teachings, the importance of community. In Buddhism, it's the three refuges of the teachings, the awakening, the Buddha, the Dharma, the teachings, and the Sangha, the community. Yeah. And I don't know how we can really function in life without that spiritual friendship, that strong community, because discernment requires that. It requires conversation and collaboration, and also conflict and cooperation. And the kind of few stories I've heard of people descending down kind of a rabbit hole of conspiracy and this swirl of confusing views and opinions. It's often people who are quite isolated or, find community in that confusion.
Yeah, which says two different things. On the one hand, they may be isolated. On the other hand, they might have found birds of a feather that they've gone down the rabbit hole with. But either way, I don't think it's conducive to our spiritual path or progress. And I know people who've been meditating for decades who've fallen into this. And obviously, I have an opinion about it because I'm using words like fallen. But I don't know. I think it's a shame, and I hope they come out of it.
Mm-hmm. Have you noticed that if folks who tend to fall into this are more isolated? Do they have strong community?
They may, but people just form their own communities. The communities kind of morph, or they reshuffle their affiliate. For instance, I have a friend. There's a monastic program in the TM movement called Purusha, and I have friends who are on that. And there's quite a few hundred guys both in India and in a facility in West Virginia. And I have a good friend in the West Virginia facility who says that they're like lunch tables, at least pre-COVID, where people actually ate together, where, there's a kind of a right-wing political one, there's a conspiracy theory table, and actually some people who've gotten into believing in flat earth theories, and then there are people who don't want any of that crap, and they just, want to focus on their spiritual progress, spiritual focus. And so even in a community, you can fragment and you can find your little niche, and the whole niche can go off on a tangent.
That's really interesting. Again, the communities I'm a part of haven't been touched so much by this, and it's interesting to, I'm kind of curious if that will emerge, or we've just been kind of protected by something.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Irene's saying talk about something different because this comes up every week. But
yeah, that's the soup we're in, and it's really it's so hard because it's just months and months of kind of coming up against the challenges of this year, but it is what we're in. For me, not so much around conspirituality or these issues, but just the fatigue of. I was looking out the window this morning and just really missing my neighborhood. It's right there, but the kind of life of the neighborhood is not the same, and the connections with neighbors and friends has just shifted so much. And so that, I was feeling sort of a little weepy this morning, kind of some heartache for I got up around 6:30, so I've been up for a while. And, it's just like, okay, I can allow that. I don't have to feel like it has to go away just because I have a call now, or, I should be over it, but just continually allowing what's happening. I mean, we're all going through that.
Yeah, and in a way, it's like an imposed retreat. I mean, you and I have been on a lot of retreats voluntarily, and we knew what we were getting into, sort of. But it's like right now, the whole society, to a great extent, has had a retreat imposed upon them, and you know how retreats can get difficult. And you can get obsessive, you fall in love with this person, or you hatch some marvelous business scheme that, that probably would totally flop, or you just kind of get all caught up in certain ways of thinking. So perhaps the sort of extreme way that people have been, perhaps people have been polarized even more by virtue of the fact that we've had to quarantine and shut down to a great extent.
Yeah, and I really have seen a huge increase in interest in meditation and practices exactly because of that. I think for some time, and maybe still, people were distracting themselves with whatever, their computers, shows, intoxicants, whatever could help them cope. But there's a point, I think, where people reach a breaking point and really need to start to tend to what keeps arising, and I've seen that with a number of friends who have, again, I never proselytize and never even recommend meditation to people, but a lot of people over the years have started meditating, friends of mine who, didn't come from this path originally. And this year I've seen all my friends who I thought never would meditate finally come to an interest in, okay, how do I tend to this? Like, how do I tend to what's going on with me? And so I really, I agree. There's some retreat quality to it. And the thing about retreat is that you're in community, you have guidance for how to address what's coming up. And so I think the challenge, especially for folks who are maybe newer to practice or, not used to self-guiding, is to continue to tend to it, not bypass it, not bury it. Of course, we're going to distract ourselves sometime, and I go into my Netflix kind of rabbit holes and numbing. But really learning how to practice and be with what's arising is the opportunity.
That's good to hear. I hadn't heard that. And I'm surprised I hadn't, because I'm talking to people all the time, but I'm really glad to hear that, there's an uptick in interest in meditation. You're probably experiencing it because you actually teach online courses and stuff, right?
Yes. And, I'm always surprised that there'll be, especially in the early days of the pandemic, you would do something online and hundreds of people would show up. And I'm really like, hundreds and hundreds of people. Wow. And 10% Happier was doing something every day of the pandemic, just a short meditation on YouTube live. And, I don't know how many people, thousands probably showed up for those.
Wow, that's great.
But I was away actually for 3 months. And just came back recently and did an event the other night that, 500 people had registered for and about half showed up for. And so there's still this kind of hunger and maybe a deepening kind of understanding of the practice that it does take.
Yeah. And,
the energy that people really want to put towards that now, because there is a refinement of life. And just recognizing what's important, and people realizing waking up is the most important thing we could all do.
I bet you that'll have a lasting impact, I mean, it's been sort of a kind of a breakthrough moment in a way, but I bet you it will continue. And if it does, then that's a blessing of this whole episode we're going through.
I think there are a lot of blessings. It's been really heartbreaking and challenging, and we're not, as moderns, good at grieving. And by moderns, I mean globally, not just Westerners, but there's sort of a loss of certain practices and ways of dealing with loss itself. But I think that as long as we really allow ourselves to, again, experience this in transformative ways, including grieving what we've lost, not just kind of bypassing to, okay, it's a portal and now we're on the other side, but really honoring what we've been through. I think there's huge possibilities for us as a world, really.
Have you ever thought about or read about the idea that a lot of ancient traditions and cultures predicted some sort of golden age, or some such thing, some sort of age of enlightenment or something coming? And have you ever thought about that? I've read a couple of books about it back in the 70s, and I thought of it more in terms of a lot of things crumbling that really didn't belong in such an age, and we see a fair amount of that happening. But what you've just been saying is the bright side to it, which is that an upsurge in interest in and participation in spirituality. So maybe we're on the cusp of something like that. Have you ever considered it?
I don't know much about what you're referencing in terms of ancient ideas about that, but I've been contemplating a lot recently as I see these changes, and again see the just brightness of these young people who are just like so much smarter, so much more tuned, healing at a much younger age than I did. And really being such lights in the world. I think today or tomorrow is the Parkland anniversary.
Oh yeah,
the
I saw
Parkland
that,
shooting.
yeah.
And those kids are, they are incredible and phenomenal. And, the march on Washington that came out of that, some of the speakers were 11, 12, 13, and so articulate, so visionary, a Greta Thunberg, just so many young leaders, the younger leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, that are just leading with such authenticity, such clarity, and love, really, that that to me is a signal of that. And again, as I mentioned, so many of them opening to spiritualities and different ways of knowing that. It took me a lot, even though I started fairly young for my age, it took me a much longer time to kind of grasp. So there is, for me, like some faith in evolution and in our collective, and I mean collective in the largest sense of that world, not just human. And so although we are likely to go through a lot of environmental challenges in the coming years, I also feel that people are waking up to the changes that we need to make.
Yeah, that's really good. Do you know Catherine? I think her name's Catherine Ingram. You know Catherine?
I don't know her. I know of her, yeah.
Yeah, I interviewed her a while back, and she wrote an article a couple of years ago, which was kind of a doomsday article, really. And there
Yeah, I read that.
Yeah, did you? Me too. And then I kind of got into a conversation with her about it through email and stuff. But what we're referring to, for the sake of the audience, is, she felt that the environmental train is not going to be stopped before it goes off the bridge, and that, within the next decade or so, we all may die. And, I was pushing back and saying, well, I can see how the evidence might suggest that, but I think nature's got a few tricks up her sleeve, and something's going to turn this around. But again, the kind of stuff you're saying gives me hope. It's
Yeah.
evidence that something's going to happen.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that really appreciate all the work she put into that, because there's a huge amount of effort that to just considering that's not her field, to kind of gather all of that information in one place and have it be such a great resource. And the thing that I just was questioning when I read it, maybe somewhat like you, was it was such a materialist kind of factual, scientific analysis that allowed for no possibility of mystery and wonder and the power of nature, not to mention the power of other beings, humans or non-human, and unseen beings, or sort of the full kind of mystical possibility that we're not the only ones driving this train, to continue with your metaphor.
Yeah.
Like we're not the conductors, actually. We're passengers at best. And so to kind of it gave humans a lot of power and agency, that idea.
Yeah. One thing that I've always thought, or ever since I started learning about this stuff, is that, and this is kind of obvious, is that the more fundamental levels of nature's functioning are more powerful, they're more influential. So, for instance, the molecular is more powerful than the mechanical, and the atomic is more powerful than the molecular, and subatomic is probably more powerful than the atomic. And in spiritual circles, it's often understood that consciousness is the most fundamental thing. And so if that is true, and I believe it is, and you probably do, then if somehow we can sort of take recourse to technologies of consciousness, if we want to call them that, then that will have the greatest leverage and be able to effect the greatest change, doing less and accomplishing more by functioning from that level. So, and like, I was reminded that when you said that her analysis seemed kind of just too scientific and mechanistic, and didn't take into account the deeper mechanics that probably are at play here.
Yeah, and the ancients might have called it ritual or ceremony or invocations, and there's so many ways that consciousness and reality lives, and yeah, when we sort of are just counting like carbon molecules and not investigating and exploring our lived love of nature and our relationship to the elements, and that doesn't, and it's not just about kind of wild nature and being in the midst of a national park, but just our relationship to the nature around us. I live in a very urban environment, and I feel part of my practice is the practice of the elements, or the practice of being in contact with all of reality, that rocks are people, and my table is people, and my computer is people, in the sense that all of this reality is alive.
Yeah, it's all consciousness appearing as this, that, and the other thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I maybe we've said it, but it could very well be that this upsurge in spirituality is, God's response, or nature's response to our predicament. It's like, okay, if we could anthropomorphize nature and say, he or she might say, okay, well, these people are screwed unless I step in and do something, so let's give them an infusion of consciousness and have that proliferate in society, and that will bring things back into balance.
Yeah, and there's so many metaphors we could use. If we're in our tween phase, and we have to actually learn how to be responsible adults and adolescents, but we might crash a car along the way, and have to learn the lesson the hard way, and so we are still evolving too.
Yeah, I like that metaphor. Humanity is, for the most part, rebellious teenagers with here and there an adult.
Yeah.
A question came in. This might be a bit of an abrupt gear shift, but Doesn't matter. Well, this is from, I don't know whether he pronounces it or she pronounces it Ade or Ade, A-D-E, from New York. Maybe you know this person. Asks, how important is having one's hierarchy of needs met, as outlined in Maslow's pyramid, on one's path to enlightenment? Can one get stuck at one level of the pyramid because it offers a sense of safety? For example, it seems that the 12-step programs are largely successful because they fulfill our need for belonging, but can this stall progress?
This is so funny because the other night someone asked me about this Maslow's hierarchy, and I don't really know it, so I'm not the best.
Let me just say a thing or two about it. So basically Maslow said it was a pyramid, and maybe Dan could even send me a graphic and I'll show it, but it was like basically, you need shelter and food, and there's a sex drive, and then a higher stage up is something a bit more refined and not quite as critical to staying alive. And then up at the very peak of the pyramid, you get self-actualization. And the idea is that if these lower levels of the pyramid are not met, you're probably not going to get interested in the top level of the pyramid.
Yeah, and I'm sure I've heard it before in the psychology class I didn't do very well in undergrad. And, different metaphors are great for different things. And I'm sure of course, there is some truth to that. I must tend to my basic needs, but even in order to have a practice, to be able to take retreat or take time to tend to a practice. But metaphors are what we have because it's so hard to explain reality. And I tend to kind of shrink away from anything that is a hierarchy.
Yeah. Well, maybe one way I can make it relevant is, can you blame people living in the South Bronx for not being interested in meditation or spirituality? Or maybe some of them are now, or people who were going through a famine or living in refugee camps in Syria or something like that.
Yeah, I think that there's actually there's some misunderstanding there of this comes to margins and centers. Having worked in refugee camps and living close to the South Bronx, living in central Brooklyn. Actually, there's a lot of spirituality in these spaces. Like that's actually probably what people tend to turn to most, and that we see that in the African American community. Slavery was survived because of a deep connection to spirit and a syncretization of African ways of knowing with the Christianity that was on hand. And so,
slavery survived, or the slaves managed to survive? You mean because they had that
enslaved
support?
People survived.
They survived, yes.
Yes. And so, I just, again, it's maybe a good metaphor for understanding an aspect of our lives, but I'm not sure it speaks to the truth, the whole truth of our reality, that I wouldn't kind of equate my whole life with that hierarchy of needs. Right.
All right, just since we mentioned it, I'm just going to quickly show it on the screen, and I also emailed it to you so that you can see it. All right, so I'm just showing that on the screen. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and he kind of, I guess, was saying that your interest in the higher ones isn't going to really kick in until the lower ones are met, and this fellow's question was, could we get stuck, trying to just maintain safety and not move on to the higher values, and how can we move on to them? I think that's what he was asking.
Yeah. So I don't know what gender this person is, but I appreciate having many types of metaphors, because that is the way language is metaphor. That's the way we understand our situation and our own awakening process. And for me, just even looking at it now that you sent it to me, the pyramid itself is already creating some kind of idea about which is which is larger, which is the foundation, which is more important. And I'm not sure that, that doesn't speak to me as true for how I've experienced things. Yeah.
Okay, good. Alrighty. So moving on through your book, we talked about rocks for people. Here's one I don't think we've talked about. Curiosity first. Why question woo-woo?
Yeah. So in that section, I talk about the fact that I was journaling many years ago, and I realized that creative and reactive are the same word. The sea just moves. And my friend Rebecca asked me, what's the sea? And I kind of played around with consciousness and compassion and different C words, but really curiosity came as the most powerful for me. That when we're not curious, when we don't sort of take that pause to understand what's happening, whether that's internally or externally happening, we could just go into a kind of reactive response. It's usually from our habituation, from our conditioning, from our previous perceptions of things. We rarely meet things in the world that are totally brand new, and that completely surprise us. So when we walk into situations, and this is why we have unconscious bias and implicit bias about people, about different spaces or things, that we are coming with, just a database in our minds that comes from our own experiences, from media, from culture. And so if we don't stay curious about what we're meeting, what we're encountering, then we're going to have a reactive response. And so true creativity, that the creative response comes from that curiosity. I would never say that we come as a blank slate, because that's not possible, but we come with just an openness to any experience. And so I talk about the word woo-woo, which is something that I use often. And, I posted recently about this on Instagram and had a lot of conversation with different people there. And some people use that word to kind of dismiss kind of a new age, sort of vague, often appropriative spirituality that is kind of not examined, that's some people's experience of it, and they call that woo-woo. But the way I often used woo-woo, and the way I've heard it, especially in mindfulness communities, is to dismiss things that are unscientific, and not provable. So it's kind of returning to the conversation we had before about, dismissing the mysterious and, relying on a particular lens or way of explaining something as more powerful, more valid. So I was asking people to question this term as a way to kind of explore, if they use the term in this way, which many people do, kind of explore what perceptions, what views, what opinions are you coming with, and can you examine those? Can you first notice them, and can you be curious and kind of creative when you approach new things, including new practices?
Yeah. When I think about curiosity, I think about children. Probably we all do, because children are so insatiably curious, about every little thing, and everything you say, they say why, and then you answer that, and they say, well, why? and most of us kind of lose that. So what would you recommend as a way of reviving that childlike curiosity and keeping it alive, no matter how old we are?
The first step for me is that embodied awareness. So, I go through these chapters. The sequence is, although it's not sequential really in our lives, but ground yourself, know yourself, love yourself, connect yourself, be yourself. And so the ground yourself is the restarting point for any moment, really. And, I'm doing it right now. I continually feel my feet on the floor as a way to reconnect to the moment, reconnect to what's really happening, not kind of just immediately going into my spiel, which I've probably done, so many times since the book came out, of talking about things in a particular way. But, really pausing, listening. For some of us, it helps to slow down. For many of us, to feel what's happening rather than just come from up here and thinking in the head. For me, as I was saying before, not being taught or conditioned to like be in my body, like feeling my seat on the floor and feeling what sensations or emotions are coming up, like right there, it kind of breaks the habit, like coming in with my preconceived perceptions or conceptions about something, and reconnects me to a moment where I can actually receive, not go into a habituated response. So, that's really the starting point for me.
Yeah, that sounds good. Habituated, I think, is a key word there. I think we come in very fresh and curious and creative and so on as little kids, and we get crusted over, by the pressures and routines and of life, and it kind of kills our inner genius over time. And I do think it can be revived, though, and spiritual practice is key to that. I think it kind of breaks the crust, it helps to clear it away, and then that natural, innocent. Remember, Christ said, "Except ye be as little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." But I think that innocence is there in even the most cynical, crusted over person, and it's just a matter of somehow breaking the shells and removing the crust. And that's not something we can do for another person, but it's something that anyone can do for themselves if they have the incentive.
Yeah, I think, it's definitely part of the intention of many spiritual paths. And I think that is one of the hardest things to actually bring forth, because so many of us just want these practices to make us feel good. And for a lot of us, feel good means just shut down and not deal with the difficulties, the difficulties that are within us. So the traumas and the things that we have to work through. And there's a certain amount of, that's why the next step is know yourself, of just self-exploration that's going to take. But it's also comes up in challenges with other people. I know, coming from a tradition that really kind of sometimes overemphasizes and even fetishizes silence, that it's in relationship that a lot of times that killing off of that innocence happens, because relationships are so fraught. There's so much projection going on, and so many ways that we can retreat into our spirituality as a way to hide from what's being reflected back to us. And so I know that community is one of the ways that has really brought that up for me in very challenging ways, of like seeing parts of myself that I don't like. That's why love yourself comes right after know yourself, and actually go kind of hand in hand of really meeting whatever comes up with this sense of kindness and compassion, and allowing these things to kind of work themselves out.
Yeah. One thought that came up as you were speaking, for some reason, I feel moved to say this, is just that whatever reason motivates a person to start meditation or start on the spiritual path is good enough. And other reasons will come along. Like, when I used to teach meditation, people would come because they had migraines or insomnia or high blood pressure or something like that, and that's good enough reason to start. Hopefully it'll help you with those things, but then after a few months, a few years, their motivations had shifted significantly, and they were looking at the kind of more profound things that we've been talking about, and maybe definitely their blood pressure had gone down.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's a kind of wake-up call or heartache, or literally with some of those conditions, that as you say is just as valid, but also just as poignant as I want to awaken.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, when I first learned, I kind of thought the meditation I was practicing was just kind of a non-medicinal tranquilizer. I enjoyed it, and it was really helping my life. I had dropped out of high school, but after learning to meditate, I got back into a community college, and things are all going better. But I really wanted enlightenment, so I actually applied to a Zen monastery up in Rochester, New York, and they said, well, you have to go work with a local Roshi first for 6 months before we'll consider it. So I went and visited this guy in Manhattan, And but then, shortly thereafter, it dawned on me that what I'm practicing actually was about higher levels of consciousness, even though that hadn't been really the introductory presentation so much. And so I don't know why I'm talking about myself too much.
No, it's beautiful. I love hearing these stories. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it doesn't take a lot, I think, to allow meditation, but really just awareness to open us up to wonder.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And open up to the mystery. It's not like we have to reach the 8th level of
Right,
whatever
yeah.
or something. Like we can, as you said at the very start, we can just have an encounter with an animal or an object or a text or our own experience and really tap into that.
Yeah. Yeah, I often find just walking down the street, walking the dogs or something, I look at a worm or I look at a blade of grass and I just contemplate the wonder of it. Irene snickering over here. But there's something amazing about every little mundane perception if we actually consider what we're seeing.
Exactly.
How many cells are in that worm, and how what an incredible complex mechanism is each little cell. And if the worm gets cut in half, he heals up and there's 2 worms. And I mean, there's just so many interesting. Every little thing is fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes, I look at an acorn,
Yeah.
or we were we were in Sicily for 3 months recently, where my husband grew up, and we were picking different acorn to seeds to plant, to replant, and there were 2 different oak trees. And I was like, how does this one know that it's that oak tree and this one know that it's that oak tree? It's
Yeah.
just a miracle or wonder. Sometimes I'll just look at my hand and think, this was my hand when I was 2, except it's not that hand, but it's the same body and the same consciousness. I mean,
Yeah.
it just takes one moment of contemplation. And that's why, I love the term contemplative and contemplative practices, to kind of bust us open and allow us to get out of that kind of habituated patterning, a lot of it being from traumatic patterning that we have, and start to really heal back into that belonging.
Do you know who Shakti Katarina Maggi is?
Mm-mm.
She's a wonderful person and a wonderful teacher, and she lives in Sicily. So next time you go to Sicily, let me know, because I want to introduce you to her.
Oh, great.
You
Cool.
could go visit her. She has a beautiful place there, and you two would really hit it off.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't forget. Remind me next time you go to Sicily. A question came in from John in Waynesville, and John has sent in several questions in previous weeks, and I always wonder where Waynesville is. So tell us sometime, John, where's Waynesville? But anyway, John's question is, what is the first course of action in seeking happiness or a more joyful existence?
Oh, wow. That's such a beautiful question. And, to me, that question is the first opening. The fact, I say in the book that on another journaling experience, I realized that belonging is an imperative, to be longing. And that longing for connection is actually the doorway, that we think it's the pain that we have to get away from, but it's actually the signal or the start, or maybe the start and the end, because we kind of always can connect to that longing. And to me, that longing for joy, for freedom, for connection, for belonging is this kind of sweet ache, and an ache in a sense of a muscle that has done good, not an ache as in a wound or a blow, but really something that we continually practice.
Good. Well, I hope that answers it, John. If it doesn't, feel free to send in a follow-up question. So you've mentioned the chapters of your book. I'm going to run through them again quickly. Delusion of separation, domination, ground yourself, know yourself, love yourself, connect yourself, and be yourself. So where are the gaps in what we've been discussing so far? what points in these chapters do you feel like you'd like to embellish more than we have?
I mentioned that love yourself, it could be the motto for the whole book. It could have been probably every chapter. There's a way in which I think one of the major challenges of being a modern is that separation from that love, that separation from that sense of place and personhood embedded in a community of loving care. So many of us have been disconnected from our ancestral cultures, from being embedded in families. Loneliness, even before the pandemic, was at epidemic levels through much of the Western world. There are whole ministries to address loneliness in different parts of Europe, that suicide and depression, anxiety, or skyrocketing rates. Again, this is before the pandemic, have only gone up. So that this practice of knowing yourself, and again, it has to start with grounding yourself, so that it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's this embodied way of being in touch with kind of the somatic experience of all of these emotions or thoughts that keep us from not belonging. And it also needs to be grounded in really knowing ourselves, because there's so many parts of ourselves, including the shadow parts, that we don't want to acknowledge or look at. So for me, just that real emphasis on loving yourself, and the practices and the things that we can take on to help support that, I think is really key.
Yeah, it seems like if you don't know yourself, then how can you love yourself? Who or what are you going to love if you don't even know what you are or who you are?
Yeah, and again, that's really looking at the things that we usually hide from, and that we're projecting outwards onto other people, and the shadow parts, the inner critics, and all the juicy bits.
Yeah, and I presume that when you say know yourself, you don't just mean your individuality and all of its features and aspects and all that, because that's not the entirety of the self, right? I mean, whether one has a Buddhist or more of a Vedantic background, there's a deeper dimension to what we are, which is ultimately universal, and like wave and ocean analogy.
Yeah, it's kind of the I use the Zen saying of, to study the Buddha way is to know the self is to forget the self is to become one with myriad things. But that chapter really is asking people to stay with knowing the self that we're often running away from, that we're trying to fix, that we're trying to bypass. And it's really in connect yourself after love yourself that I really look at, dissolving the barriers. And I talk about the elements practice and, other kind of ways of understanding our interconnection that goes beyond our small self.
Let's talk about that, because we haven't talked about that too much yet.
Yeah, so I mentioned in that chapter something that is a deep part of the mindfulness, the traditional classical mindfulness practices. So, what we call mindfulness, for the most part, comes from the Satipatthana Sutta, which is a particular teaching from the Pali Canon. And we've taken very choice points from the Satipatthana Sutta and kind of ignored some of the others. And one of those is, and it's in the first foundation, there are 4 foundations of mindfulness, is this practice of mindfulness of the 4 elements. And I just find it so fascinating that we've left it out. And I have some, thoughts about kind of the bypass of things that seem more kind of elemental, literally, but also kind of basic and not important, because they're not about us and our psychology, and but it's such a profound practice. I'm really on a one-woman mission to really bring this back into a mainstream practice. And also because the elements practice, you find it through ancient cultures literally around the world, like every continent, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, you find it in Ayurveda, you find it in Chinese medicine, Native American, indigenous spiritualities around the world. Sometimes it's not 4, it's 5 or 6, but this idea of using the natural world and its elements as metaphors for interconnection is so powerful, and it's such a simple practice. It's really just to contemplate and be aware of earth element, water element, fire element, and air element internally, externally, and both internally and externally. So it's a felt sense experience of those inside of us. It's a contemplation and experience of those around us, and then it's understanding that it dissolves that barrier between inner and outer to recognize that we are these elements. So, I love it as a very simple but profound practice, like practical practice.
So I don't know if you could elaborate on it more here to make it even more clear to people what you're saying, but I presume you teach this in courses?
I do, yeah. I've done an online course for Tricycle Magazine that's accessible. It goes through each element, and I have a couple of talks or meditation on my website too. But it's really simple, the earth element is what's solid. So we really feel that sense of groundedness, and we start with that. It always starts with the earth element. We see that in cultures around the world, starting with these kind of grounded practices. And so you feel your muscles, you feel your bones, you feel the weight of your body, and feel that density and connection with the earth underneath. And then you move to the water element, which is all that is fluid and moist. And so, you can feel the wetness behind your eyes or in your mouth, and acknowledge that we're mostly water and the world is mostly water, and kind of the paradox of that. Like, we don't feel mostly liquid, but we are. And then to feel the fire element as kind of temperature in the body, and the energy and power of that, and the sun epitomizing that. And then to feel the air element, which is maybe a more common practice for people, to feel the breath and to recognize that this is an element that connects us not only in this moment with each other, but throughout time, that we're breathing the same air as all the ancients and all our ancestors.
So, literally, right now, each breath you and I take, we're breathing in some molecules that Buddha or Jesus breathed. Yeah.
And so, again, a really simple practice. And I always say, and I say in the book, we're not practicing to become good meditators. We're practicing to kind of bring this kind of awareness into our lives. And so I use the elements practice all day. If I'm in the shower, I'm feeling water. If I'm turning on the stove, I'm interacting with fire. And so it kind of switches us out of this wordy, logical, mind-centered way of interacting, and to really come into that, as we've been speaking about, that knowing that everything's consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like it would make one more grounded and integrated and, living in not only the now, but in terms of like living in what they're actually experiencing, as opposed to being sort of off in la la land while they're doing something else.
Exactly. Yeah.
Huh. That's interesting. I once read a paper by a physicist who went into in fact, people could look it up if they want. It's by John Hagelin, and it's called Is Consciousness the Unified Field? And you'll find it if you do a Google search. But he went into this whole explanation about how this idea of 4 or 5 elements, some say Akasha or space is the 5th, is not just some primitive, ancient understanding. It actually, he correlated it with modern physics in terms of the spin types of fundamental particles. And
oh wow, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, and most of the paper is over my head because he's a bunch of equations and all sorts of things. But that bit I remember, and that he felt like they had really gotten onto something in terms of the most fundamental way that nature actually functions as understood by modern physics.
Incredible. Yeah, I would love to look that up.
Yeah, make a note.
Yeah, I am. Checking out my journal where I put all my notes.
Yeah. So, go ahead. I'll let you jot that down. So it's John Hagelin, Hagelin.
Thank you.
And the title of the paper was "Is Consciousness the Unified Field?" Yeah. All right. So that, I guess, mostly relates to connect yourself. And then, are these all sequential? I mean,
Yeah, again, metaphors is all we have, and it's given us beautiful things like poetry, but it's also given us linear thought. And so, yes, I kind of lay them out in a sequential way, and I don't think that it's sequential in our lived life. So I do believe we have to have some kind of embodied knowing to really go into this question of belonging. But yeah, it's not like I get up and use a 5-step process throughout my day to meet every moment. Yeah. So yeah, be yourself is kind of the last one, but I find it such a beautiful one. And I really, in that chapter, I talk a lot about my sister, who is intellectually disabled. She's my older sister, but I've, really been kind of entrusted with a lot of care for her since a young age. And I kind of use her experience of our mother's death and our relationship together to explore this idea of really being your full self. And I talk a lot about, I talk some about intimacy and imagination there, and the importance of being intimate with our experience. And I think that's what the previous 6 chapters were really about, of learning how to kind of become intimate with ourselves and with the world around us, and then imagination as the place where that curiosity can lead to creativity, to generative opportunities. And I use where my sister lives now, which is a community in upstate New York that's a Rudolf Steiner connected community. They're called Camp Hill communities, and it's one of just the most beautiful, thoughtful, imaginative, intimate, creative places I've ever been. And I actually use this idea of the conspiracy of consciousness, and talk about how to conspire means to breathe with. And so we use conspiracy often nowadays, especially as a pejorative, but that we can conspire in positive ways. Like we can conspire, as we are doing now, to actually encourage and invite, more wisdom, compassion, awakening into the world.
You said in one of your earlier chapters that your sister, although she's intellectually challenged, she's emotionally very developed. Is that right?
Yeah, so she's 54, and she has led 54 years of life. She's a woman, and she's been through surgeries and losses and lived in different continents and traveled back and forth a lot. So she has this, wisdom of just what it means to be alive that long. And she can't express it necessarily through language and intellectual ways, but she is very emotionally astute. And so responds to...
Doesn't miss a trick, right?
She really doesn't. And she, when we were living together, both grieving our mom's death, she lived with us for a year after my mom died. Some days I would wake up and she could just tell I was just tired and exhausted from trying to figure out, what would be the best situation for her and exploring options. And she would just stand at, the other end of the hallway and she'd say, "Come here. Come here, come here," and she'd give me a big hug. And,
That's great.
just that real emotional openness and honesty.
Is that, I wasn't totally clear on how your sister was an example of be yourself, but is that it right there? I mean, she just, what you see is what you get, no guile, no subterfuge, no complications like many people have.
Yeah, and just her own way of processing, like the grief that we were processing together. She did this thing for weeks after my mother died, where she would name everyone who had died. that she knew as kind of a way to process her mom's death. She would say, so-and-so died, and, her uncle died, and Michael Jackson died, and just go through this list, which was a long list.
Yeah.
And then she would go through the list of everyone who was going to die, which is
Everybody.
Everyone.
Right.
So she would kind of go through the list of all of our family and friends and our dog, and and sometimes she would get things wrong. She'd be like, Stevie Wonder's dead, and I'm like, no, Stevie Wonder's not dead yet, but Obama's gonna die. She just whatever. And it was a death meditation.
It's kind
of
wise.
Also
it's very wise. Yeah.
Yeah, which is is part of the mindfulness practice, is the mindfulness of death and contemplating death, and that was her way of processing, and it was a beautiful meditation for us. Mm-hmm. Right? She would do this multiple times a day for weeks.
It's interesting.
And so we would just kind of go through this lesson patiently, kind of say yes, 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 no, yes, no. And it was such a gift, right? Of just being herself, of and giving us this incredible teaching.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, contemplating death is a spiritual practice. You remember that famous painting of a monk looking at a skull? I forget what that painting is, but various spiritual teachers, Shankara, Amma, various others, have said that we should kind of live life as though our next breath may be our last. Or as Amma put it, live like a bird perched on a branch that might just break at any time.
Right.
And there's nothing morbid about it, nothing scary about it. It's more like get real, and realize the ephemeral nature of life and make hay while the sun shines, I guess,
Right. Yeah. And she wasn't, sad or morbid. She was just really matter of fact, and such a gift and invitation, really.
Yeah. Here's a nice question that came in from someone named Leslie in Amesbury. My geography skills are weak. I don't know where Amesbury is, but Dan, you got to find out where these places are. Dan fields the questions. Leslie says, I work with kids with social emotional problems. Do you have any suggestion for ways of working with students like this, elementary, middle school, to help support their healing from trauma from trauma? Big question, but just wondering if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you for doing that work, first of all, because that is the work we need, is to really start young and to address some of these things. There's been huge growth in what's often called trauma-sensitive mindfulness. There's actually a book, I think it's by David Trevlane, and it's of that title, but there, a lot of work being done around somatic experiencing, which is a trauma-centered therapeutic approach that really recognizes that trauma is stored in the body. There's the work of Bessel van der Kolk, who coined the term and has the book, The Body Keeps the Score. So there are a lot of resources out there, more and more coming into the educational field. You might want to check out Mindful Schools, which is based on the West Coast and has a lot of online programming as well, and is very connected to that trauma-sensitive framework. But there are more and more resources, and I would just say, as a big caveat and a starting point, is to take care of one's own self. So especially people who are in caregiving professions, who are first responders, who are teachers, there can be this emphasis on kind of serving, giving, taking care of others. But the only way we can really serve is by leading as an example, and then sharing, kind of what's real for us. So just to really make sure that you are not just seeking that out in service of others, but that you take care of your own needs.
Yeah, I've personally always felt meditation to be such a battery recharger. It's like you can just feel exhausted and burned out, and sit down and meditate, and you come out half an hour or an hour later feeling like you just had a good night's sleep or something. It's just really can recharge you. So, and if you can do that regularly, you build up a kind of a reservoir or something that is that carries you through difficult situations. So I wish all the healthcare workers and people who are experiencing burnout could have access to something like that.
Yeah, just to plug 10% Happier, I get nothing from this, even though I work for them.
It's okay.
But they have made their app free for first responders, for healthcare workers, for grocery workers, for teachers, and are open. If you can't afford the app, you can always contact them and they'll help you.
Yeah. How expensive is it if you pay for it?
I don't think it's that much. It's
like a monthly
less
subscription or something?
Yeah, it's. I think it's probably around $10 a month, something like that.
Yeah, Sam Harris does that too with his Waking Up app. It's like, if you can't afford it, it's free. No questions asked. The Harrises are very generous boys. Okay, so we're getting on. Well, we have a little time left if you want to cover some more points. Is there anything we haven't covered that you feel you after we hang up, you're going to think, darn, I wish we had covered that?
I don't shy away at all in the book, and we've talked a little bit about it around issues of identity and race, and just coming from different realities, perspectives, from different points along those margins and centers. And, it's something that I would like to just emphasize, that is a place of possibility, that we've had so much wounding in this country, but around the world, and these being separative identities. And so in that equation of we are not separate and we are not the same, that we have this real opportunity to learn from each other. And I would say that one balance of that equation is that a lot of folks of color and especially Black people in this country, to survive, we've learned a lot about white culture, about dominant culture. That's the general education and kind of information we get. And just a real invitation for white folks who are listening and in general to kind of use this as an opportunity to not kind of fall into the bypass of we are not separate, but really use the diversity that we're surrounded by to learn about other cultures, to read books from other perspectives, from other communities, and just the richness that I've seen that comes from that. I work in a lot of multicultural communities, and I run a lot of retreats where we really intentionally create a balance, particularly around race, but other identities as well. And it is so healing for everyone when there can be that opportunity to really, especially for white folks, to step forward around that.
Can you give 2 or 3 specific recommendations? You mentioned books, and what can people do?
I have a friend, I like to tell this story, my friend Elaine, who is in her 60s or mid-60s. She's a white Jewish, Ashkenazi Jewish lesbian. And we used to teach together a lot and became very close, and we would see each other, a few times a week, usually, when I was working full-time at a meditation center. And we'd always talk about what books we were reading. And for a while, every time I saw Elaine, she would name a novel or a nonfiction book by a Black woman. And so finally, I just said, Elaine, what's going on? And she said, oh, well, I've spent 60 some years basically only reading white people. So I've decided I'm only going to read Black women for the next. And she went to a website and she kind of just cut and pasted the reading list. I think it was Well Read Black Girl or one of those, wonderful sites. And she was just kind of making the commitment to change her perspectives, change her understanding of things, kind of see things from the margins. And so I challenge myself with that. I, try and educate myself in things that I'm less aware of. So spent, a few years ago, some time really learning about what's called fat liberation and body positivity, and kind of looking at the ways that I had absorbed all these ideas about fatness and the biases that I had kind of just adopted from the society, and started listening to fat people and fat activists online.
I take it they don't mind our using that word.
Yeah, they actually reclaim that word.
Okay.
Yeah, so I learned that,
Yeah.
and so there was that to learn. Recently, I've been trying to educate myself more on disability activism and ableism, and really had some kind of eye-opening perspectives about ability and disability, and just by reading books and following different people on Instagram. There's a great film called Crip Camp on Netflix that is just beautiful. It's so,
CRIP, like the Crips, the Bloods and the Crips.
yes. So they, a reclamation of crippled, right? So this
Oh,
camp,
that kind of Crip. I see. Okay.
yes, and it's the story of this summer camp that existed in the late 60s and early 70s for disabled youth, and then tells the story of the activists who worked to pass the American with Disabilities Act. And it was a whole history of activism that I'd never been aware of, and a conversation and perspectives that I wasn't aware of. So, broadening our awareness, broadening our understanding by changing kind of what we take in, by noticing what we take in, and looking for different voices, that's really the beauty in we are not the same.
I'm glad we drifted onto this topic because, we started out talking about separation, and, most of us are oblivious to such a great extent of what other people go through, various types, like the kinds of people you just mentioned. And we probably have, not only are we oblivious, but we have all these biases and attitudes and all that we're not even aware of. And it really does seem to be, whether you frame it in a spiritual context in terms of, spiritual growth, or just being a decent human being functioning properly in society, it seems like the time has come that we really need to sensitize and educate ourselves about these other perspectives, in order not to be a jerk, unwittingly, in order to be inclusive and kind and, compassionate.
And in order to awaken.
Yeah,
right.
really.
That's because if we have these blind spots, then we're not seeing clearly, And so that's there's this subtle way, and I can fall into this too, where we think that the absolute truth is more true. Like it's truthier in some way, even though it's called the two truths. And so this is where that relative spiritual exploration, and I do feel that learning and loving each other is part of our spiritual practice, that relative spiritual exploration is just as much a part of our awakening, because as our consciousness awakens to all the ways that we've actually created barriers between us and others, it actually starts to dissolve those barriers. Well, first show us that they were there and see the kind of separative consciousness that we're moving with unconsciously. And really, that's where we're headed, is to this unbounded love that is not clouded by these unconscious separative ways.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You can't love your neighbor as yourself if you, and you can't appreciate unbounded love if you have all these blind spots about people, about groups of people, and so on. I just want to touch on the absolute truth being more true point, which I think the only it's, I know where that idea comes from. It's more, the absolute truth is permanent, I guess you could say. There's a verse in the Gita which goes, the unreal has no being, the real never ceases to be. So, the gold ornaments might be melted down and you might turn rings into bracelets or something like that, but it's all, the gold is the same gold in both circumstances. I think it's go ahead.
I think it's just a perceptual misunderstanding, because we are only seeing things in terms of our understanding of time. But I think material manifestation is just as it's timeless in its own way.
Yeah. there's actually a traditional sort of tug of war between these perspectives, between Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism, where Vedanta has the Mandukya Upanishad, which is kind of like nothing ever happened, the universe never even manifested, the whole thing is an illusion. Whereas Kashmir Shaivism is more like, wait a minute, this whole relative creation is actually the divine, in more of an embodied, playful form, and is worthy of reverence, and not something to sort of be escaped from as soon as possible. I just want to mention on this theme that we've been just discussing that I've been going to the Science and Nonduality conference for years, although it was canceled lately because of the pandemic. But at one point, there's a friend of mine named Vyavaharika Schallenberg who's been on Batgap, and she started going, and she went to the organizer. She said, "Wait a minute, where are all the women? Where are all the black people? Where are all the gay people or whatever?" Because it was just sort of this. A lot of white men up on stage talking non-duality. And so they really took that to heart, and the whole thing has become extremely diverse, and, And they also have a whole group called the Young Sages, which all these kids under the age of, 22 or something like that, and they all come on a scholarship, and there's a whole group of young people sort of thinking and planning and getting up and reading poetry to the whole group, and it's really cool to see how that has evolved.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Happy to hear that. And yes, that's also a group that I really try and learn from, and have been really privileged because of the work I did for so many years to have been influenced by youth culture for most of my adult life. But I try and really pay attention to the kids, because they understand so much, and they often have such incredible ways of expressing it.
Yeah. Good. All right, I'm going to show your website here. There it is. SebeneSelassie.com, right?
Yes.
You belong. You are not separate. You never were. You never will be. So I'll be linking to this from your page on batgap.com. And if people go there, there's an events menu, which I'm sure you have all kinds of. There we go. I'm looking at it now. Oh, there's your Batgap interview listed, and other kinds of things that you have planned. So as usual, people can probably just go there and look at what you have to offer and get on your mailing list and everything else. But is there anything particular, either coming up soon, or if someone listens to this a few years from now, or maybe both things, that you want to call people's attention to?
Yeah, I think the best way is my website, and my name won't change, so my website probably won't change either. And my newsletter I send out on the new moon and full moon, and
that's a nice practice.
It's usually very filled with kind of musings and resources. I might list events, but it's not kind of a promotional newsletter. It's really, I try and share what practices and also music and books and things are influencing me, and hope that it's nourishing for other folks too.
Good. And you are on the 10% Happier podcast or app quite a bit. I listened to quite a few of those during the week, so people can check that out too.
Yeah, I'm on the app, and I've been on the podcast a few times, and people can find me there too.
Good. Well, thanks, Sebene. I've enjoyed spending some time with you.
Yeah, it's been really great, Rick. It's a really beautiful conversation. I didn't know where it would start or go, but it really was, fun exploration.
I didn't know either, actually. I was kind of... Larry King had the he died recently, but he had the philosophy that he didn't want to know anything about his guests, because he wanted to sort of be just like his audience and just totally in the dark and start asking questions.
Beautiful.
Sometimes that worked for him, sometimes it didn't. Like he interviewed, who was it? Marlon Brando one time, and he said it was his toughest interview because he'd ask a question and Brando would just say, "Yeah." And then he wouldn't know what to do next. But I remember there was one clip they played recently after he died where he was interviewing Jerry Seinfeld, and he obviously hadn't really prepared, and Seinfeld said, "Do you even know who I am?" But anyway,
might have been good.
I have a
I'll
sort of
speak
a
up.
balance between preparation and winging it.
I think you struck a beautiful balance. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. And thanks to those who've been listening or watching. As you know, this is an ongoing series. If this is new to you, go to batgap.com and you can sign up to be notified by email of new ones. Or if you'd like YouTube to notify you, just subscribe on YouTube. And as you may know, there's that little, after you hit the subscribe button, a little bell pops up. And then if you click the bell, then you can opt to be notified even more or all the time of any time there's a new thing, which in my case is about once a week. My next guest will be Richard Tarnas, who is a cosmologist teaching at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I have two great, big, humongous books that he just sent me that I'm going to try to read as much of during the week because cosmology fascinates me. And so that should be an interesting conversation. And of course, there are many others scheduled, and we continue to schedule them. If you'd like to see what's upcoming, there's an upcoming interviews page on Batgap where we show everything that has been scheduled. So thanks again, and we'll see you for the next one. And thanks again, Sebene.
Thank you, Rick.
Say hi to Dan for me if you talk to him.
I will.